Hello and welcome to the Farmhouse. I'm Candace Worzbowski.
And I'm Stephanie Spiker.
Recently, I spoke to Beth Hoffman, a journalist and author of the book Bet the Farm. Bet the Farm is about Beth and her husband's journey into agriculture. Before coming to farming, Beth had worked as a journalist. She wrote on food systems and agriculture, so she was already familiar with the industry, but writing about something is not the same as doing something. And I have to ask you, Steph, you are an agricultural journalist. You've been one for the last 9 years, so you no doubt know more about farming and ag than the average person on the street. If you had to start farming tomorrow, could you?
I feel like probably not. I think it's more like in theory, yes. In actuality, it would be a big learning curve. I think, I have been doing this for what feels like a long time. I mean, it's almost 9 years. It is kind of a long time. So I do think I have a very solid understanding of a lot of aspects of agriculture, be it marketing and economics, soil, whatever, all these different things. But to actually take all of that not really random, but it's like a lot of different subjects of knowledge that I've learned over the years, and to put it into practice, I think is very different. So yeah, it would be a really steep learning curve, but I also feel like I guess I'd be at least a few steps ahead of someone who just like stumbled into it, I suppose.
Yeah, I think you'd figure it out. I don't think I would. I think I'd be terrible at it. I mean, I guess eventually I could learn, but with the knowledge that I have now, and I have only been at this job about half as long as you have, I think I'd drown pretty quickly. But as you can imagine, Beth and her husband came up against a number of challenges, and really the same challenges that many farmers face, and together they figured it out. So let's welcome her into the farmhouse and hear her story. Beth, welcome to the farmhouse.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, so your path to farming is a slightly unconventional one. What sparked the shift from, a successful career in food and agricultural journalism and academia into becoming, a farmer in Iowa?
Yeah, I mean, I would clarify that a lot of farmers are like us. Beginning farmers tend to be in their 50s. They're people who are inheriting land, much as we were going to do. So we're not unusual in that way. But yes, I was a professor in San Francisco. I was a journalist covering food and agriculture for many years. I met my husband, who was an Iowa farm boy, then moved to San Francisco to go to culinary school, and became a butcher actually for 12 years. And a wine buyer in there as well. But then he really wanted to move back to Iowa. And so, it made sense in the fact that I never lived anywhere solidly for my adult life. So it wasn't that strange to kind of live somewhere else. But I had never lived in Iowa. I had never lived in a rural community. I had never lived on a farm. I had covered a lot of farms. I'd been on a lot of farms, but I had never actually done the farming myself. So it was very unusual in that regard. Although, now that I meet people and I talk about the book and people read the book, the amount of people who contact me who are in a similar situation is kind of astounding, actually, how many people. I think there's I actually discuss in the book, there's a real mythology around farming and homesteading, and it's going to be, really back to the land, getting your hand in the dirt and that kind of thing. And so I think more and more city slickers like myself are doing this kind of thing. But yeah, it's unusual. We have 530 acres of John's family's land that we took over. And so, yeah, it's not like a small potatoes, little garden kind of a place.
Right. All right. So what were some of the biggest surprises that you encountered when you went through this transition, I guess both personally and professionally? Like you said, a lot of people, really like the idea of getting back to the land, but it's not always so simple as that.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, having reported on a lot of farms, I had really been focused on a lot of sustainable kind of techniques, and you kind of see that in a lot of different places. You go from farm to farm and people are doing all sorts of incredible things. But the economics of farming was something that I didn't really know much about. And I learned we learned very quickly, even before we moved out, was just kind of doing spreadsheets and looking at the kind of business side of it. Like, it's very, very difficult to make a living on a farm, no matter what you do, no matter what kind of farming. So that was the biggest surprise, maybe, was just the economics of it all. It was really surprising because, you forget to ask as a journalist, like, if this is so great, why isn't everybody doing this thing that you're doing? And you kind of just look like, oh, look, it's so great. And you kind of report on that aspect of it without really thinking about that. So, yeah, that was the biggest surprise.
Yeah. So you wound up writing a book about your experience. As we mentioned in the introduction, it's called Bet the Farm. So what about your experience made you think, I bet other people could learn from this or at least be entertained by the story?
Well, as a journalist, I call this the dog ears, when you kind of hear something and you go like, what?
Like perk up.
Like a dog would do, like with their ears. And so there were just so many times that happened for me while we were getting ready to move back here and once we had moved back here, there were just so many moments of like, what? I didn't know that. And so it was very clear to me that if I didn't know it after reporting on these things for 20 years at the time, then people didn't know these things, like in the general public. And I also felt like I hadn't really ever read anything that was really empathetic to farmers. Like, my goal was to just say, like, how did we get here without really pointing fingers, particularly at farmers? Because I think that they've gotten in the situation, for example, here in Iowa, of growing corn and soybeans. They've gotten into this position for quite logical reasons, actually. It's not like they were just minions of big business, or they just did what they were told, or they weren't educated enough. They were making economic decisions at every point, and that's where this kind of evolved from. So it also seemed very important to talk about the reasons why we're here in a very realistic way without pointing fingers, so that maybe we can fix it. We can't fix the problems if we don't admit to them or don't really look at them.
Yeah. Could you give an example of like one of those problems that you think it's due to explore?
Well, I mean, I think just the system, the way it's set up, people kind of, we were just with some friends and they were in Italy and they were like, oh, in this small town. And there was this delicious cheese from the town and this ham. And then we kind of think like, well, okay, well, why couldn't we do that in Iowa? Why don't we have that kind of a system? And, you just kind of laughed a little bit because like, it feels ridiculous to even say, but the example I would give is just this sort of idea that the U.S. was set up as a colony. We grew as a place for people to come here and to live for economic reasons so that we could support the empire with cheap goods from abroad. And that's the system that we adopted from the get-go here. And that's a very large reason why we are still that way today. We established farms along rail routes. People got roped into that even. I mean, there's parts of the book where I talk about how railroad companies, kind of hyped up how great it was going to be along their rail line, and how, because they owned all the land. So they made a lot of money from people settling along this ground that was literally stolen from native people who had been there, meaning that treaties that were agreed to were not ever followed through with. It's not just like a thing to say, like stolen land. Like, no, it was actually, there was a treaty, and then we did not uphold our end of the treaty. And railroad companies came in and they were given all of the land along the railroad, and then they hyped up people who moved out there, who then found out, like Laura Ingalls Wilder's family, they actually went out, and in reality, not just in the books, but they moved out to hit it, make it rich on farming, which never actually happened.
Right.
So it's one of those examples. It's a very large, broad example, but why we grow corn today and we export, and the whole state of Iowa is dependent upon this kind of agriculture, because we are a state that exports virtually everything that we grow. And we take this very rich land and we grow very cheap commodities. And we think that that equation will somehow work out without government assistance year after year. And it doesn't.
Yeah. Okay. So in Bet the Farm, you describe learning farming, quote, on the ground. Is there a moment or a story that you think best captures, what it really feels like to become a farmer? Or was there a moment where like all of a sudden it hit you like, this is it? Like I am officially a farmer right now.
Yeah, I actually wrote about it. I don't think in the book, but in the, because it came after the book, but in our blog, where John, my husband, he went away. He never goes away, but he went away. And my mother was like, as kind of New York as you can get. She was out, and we had kind of set the whole thing up where we could move the cattle each day from paddock to paddock, because they're grass finished and fed their whole lives. So it means that they have to move every day. So we were doing this every day. We were going out for a couple hours, moving them, putting up the fencing, taking down the fencing. And I was really proud of myself. Like, oh, I got this, And then the day that she was supposed to leave, we arrived to find all of the cows out. And, and so it was a pretty hilarious situation where we were kind of, I didn't really know what I should do, because they wouldn't follow me so easily. And I didn't have a way of really like getting someone behind them and push, kind of having them come in like we usually do. So I just kind of drove around with the side-by-side and put out fencing, and had my mom kind of run along and try and put up posts. And we just tried to like make a new paddock where they were. Mm-hmm. But that meant then I had to move the watering system, and I had to do all this stuff. So yeah, it was the moment that I was like, oh, this is what farming really is dealing with not the good times, not the easy stuff, right? But the moment when all the cows are out.
Yeah.
You got to actually
the problem
handle
solving.
That. Yeah.
All right. So because you have a background in journalism and storytelling, I wanted to ask you, what stories do you think are still being underreported about food systems and farming?
Yeah. I do communications work now for the Iowa Food System Coalition, and we do a podcast that it's very highly edited though. So we have like many different voices on a topic. It's more kind of the journalism that I came out of style. So they're only like 10, 15 minutes long. And I feel like that makes it in a time frame that people can digest. So that's something. But, I think it's part of the problem from the sort of nonprofit coalition kind of side is that we often go around talking about local food and growing food, even just growing food in Iowa, as like something that's really great. And it is. But I think that what we have to talk about a lot more is the way that this sort of system solves a lot of our problems in the state. So I've been trying to, do a lot more communications in that vein. And I think that I would love to see journalists kind of think about that. Like, okay, we have really serious water problems here in Iowa, nitrates in the water and erosion, of course. But like, how do we actually tell stories about how we can solve these problems? Because I think journalism has been so keen on telling the same sort of stories about the problems, and or this kind of situation that I used to do is like, here's a farm, and this one farm is doing this one thing. Isn't that great? So kind of looking at giving things more of a systems view. I would just love to see more of that journalism. And I also find there's problems, and this is because staffs are cut and places don't have the resources. But like I've spoken out about things like the ACA, the changes to the Affordable Care Act, and how that's impacting us on the farm. Well, then every news organization is contacting me about that. And that feels like not great journalism. If we're just like have one or two key people that you keep going back to and you ask the same things and each paper reports on that, then that's like a sample size of one.
Right.
And it's just not that effective journalism. So I would love to see more stories that were like people just on the ground, walking around, talking to people. What do you think? Hey, what do you think? You know? And there is some of that great stuff that's happening on local levels in all different states, but that doesn't seem to carry over, you know. And I'll just say the third thing that I kind of think needs to be improved is this casting like an Iowa farmer as if everybody in Iowa voted the same way, like every farmer, you know, whenever there's sort of, you write something about farmers in Iowa and how they're struggling, you look at the comments and the comments now are like, well, that's what you voted for. That's you got what you asked for. And it's like, we're not a monolithic group, and there's a lot more nuance to it. So I think that's the reason why everybody wants to do a story about a farmer in Iowa who's complaining about the Affordable Care Act changes, because, you know, we're trying to say, like, the subtext of that is like someone who voted for Trump is now complaining about this. And that is poor journalism too.
Right. It kind of turns into clickbaity territory, I think.
Yeah. And it just, it doesn't inform anybody of anything. That like, there's no like, wow, I didn't know that. Oh, I learned something while I read this article. I learned something new. Right.
Yeah.
Oh, I learned that people aren't all the same in one place, or with the same skin color, or with the same job.
Right. Well, speaking of learning, you've spoken in college classes and community settings. What message do you most want young people, both inside and outside of agriculture, to take away from your experiences?
Well, I guess there's two things I'll say to that. The first is just that everything, you got to remember that everything is within a context, and there's a history, and there's a how we got here. That's really critical to understand about anything in the world, right? And I think that when you're young, you tend to think like this thing just happened and out of the context of history. So I really want people to understand like how we got here today. It's something that was happening over the last 200 years. And yes, maybe more, you know, people understand kind of from the Michael Pollan kind of writing that things might have changed after World War II, but the kind of like condensing it all to just say like corporate greed got us here, the end, and now we got to change things. It doesn't look at the on the ground and who's making the decisions every day. And again, it doesn't, like I said earlier, it doesn't make farmers human beings that make choices. And have made choices, and their generations before made choices. And so I think that's a really important thing that I just want to emphasize. And the second part, it's not just for college classes. I would include things like libraries, right? Because I speak to a lot of libraries, and who comes to libraries to hear someone talk about a book? It's generally elderly people. And so I would say both those groups, you know, to really understand that farming is not very profitable, and that even if you're growing the status quo crops, corn and soybeans here, generally speaking, everyone is kind of struggling, and everybody has off-farm jobs. And so I think if you know that as a young person, your perspective can shift a little bit to think, okay, how can I make this happen like having a half-time job, and then I can do this over here, and if this is what I love is farming, it's not going to probably happen that I just like arrive on a farm and I'm up and running and I'm making money and I'm supporting my family. It's not reality. And that also puts in context for the elderly crowd, who many of them are like, well, what do I do with this land for the next generation? No one in my family wants to farm, but I want somebody to do it sustainably, but I want this, but I also want income from the land. That's not really reality either. So if you really care about the land and the sustainability of it, you have to make some wiggle room to get people on the land. And that's kind of, one of the things I like to talk about is that regenerative agriculture, this is a term that's thrown around a lot these days. And we would say that we do regenerative agriculture. But right in the middle of that word is generations. Like it's going to take generations of people who are stewarding the land. So it doesn't really matter what John and I do if as soon as we're dead, our kids like rent it out to someone for the highest bidder, and that's it.
Right.
So I think that we have to really be innovative in that in-between space and help young people navigate it, help old people navigate it, to figure out how do we get people on the land to stay on the land for the next 7 generations or more.
Right. Okay. So that brings us to our last question. It's what we always end on here. What does it mean to be a woman in agriculture?
I don't know how to answer that exactly, because I don't know that, the task of farming is gendered. But I will say that the assumption is that the men farm and the women, many farms that I know of, do the marketing, which is basically what's happened to us. So I think being a woman in agriculture is an interesting thing, because many of us, are doing the selling, are doing the communications, are doing the purchasing for our families. If you think about customers, and if you think about any kind of customer, the target audience is always a woman, for everything, even men's like products, right? It's always like a woman between 28 and 65 or something, right? Because we're the ones who purchase everything. So it's an interesting kind of world in agriculture. I think that's not necessarily different from a lot of other fields where women are really a lot of the decision makers, the money keepers, the money movers, the behind the scenes, everything. And not to belittle what men do, obviously we need somebody to go out there every day and move the cattle. Now, like we've kind of split these jobs in part to maintain our relationship, because it wasn't healthy for us to work together, live together, sleep together, eat together, like we've got to have, it's a rural area. There's not like a whole lot of people that we're like seeing on a daily basis. So, we had to kind of divide and conquer too, because there was just way too much work in a day and way too much stress, as I wrote about in the book. So being a woman in agriculture, I guess I would just sum it up by saying, is like, it's a very interesting and very, I think, undervalued and underrealized role. Like, I don't think that most people realize that women are kind of doing most of, especially on this kind of scale farm where we're selling to direct to consumers, it's mostly women that are doing that kind of selling.
Right. Okay. Well, Beth, thank you so much for stopping by the farmhouse today.
Thanks for having me.
I have to love that Beth's true, welcome to the farm moment was cows getting out. Because I feel like even just on FarmHouse specifically, but then in other interviews and stuff I've done, it's like every single farmer I've talked to, it feels like if they raise livestock of any kind, have a story about the animals getting out and having to like chase them down the road or whatever it might be. So I just had to laugh that was her like, yeah, this was my moment when it was like, oh, I'm a farmer now.
Yeah,
it's like, that's a valid one.
It's such a common, and I don't want to say funny because it is quite stressful when it happens, but in hindsight, like there are some really funny stories about, it's always the cows. Normally. When they get out.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that there isn't like an idiom in the English language about like when the cows get loose or something like that. Like we have like the horses out of the barn or something like that.
Yeah.
But
there's a lot about horses though, right?
Yeah,
there's like
I feel like there should be one
leading a horse to water and all this nonsense.
There's nothing about when the cows have left the field or whatever.
Maybe we should start one.
Maybe
we'll
start one around here. The cow is out of the pasture.
The cows are out, man. We got to really get it together.
So I am curious about your thoughts on Beth's views on agricultural journalism, especially because, you know, you are an agricultural journalist.
Yeah, the one that surprised me a little bit was, and I don't want to misquote her, so I don't remember exactly how she phrased it, but how maybe she just didn't think it needed to have as much importance put on, here's a farmer doing something well. And, you know, she was saying we need to look at things more broadly, which I don't disagree with the statement that, yeah, we need to look at ag as a broad thing and not always as an individual. But at least in my time working here, I feel like the stories people resonate with the most and really want to read are stories about essentially someone just like them who is succeeding, and this is how they're succeeding. Or this is their story, and it happens to be maybe a nice, touching story about a family, or I don't know.
Yeah.
But, you know, I just feel like, not necessarily myself specifically, but here at Lancaster Farming, people have reached out to us and talked to us in person even about how much they love those kind of stories. So that surprised me a little bit, because that is not the vibe I get at all, that people are like, that's not helpful, we need to like look elsewhere.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I feel like there is room for both.
Yeah.
You know, like, yeah, absolutely. We should be looking at larger issues and like kind of dismantling what's really going on here. But feature stories are important because they may seem like they're very specific, but actually they're very applicable to a lot of people's lives.
Right. Like maybe you'll learn something that maybe you just never thought of to try on your farm, and you read someone else. Or maybe it's like, you know, I've been considering adding this value-added product. Oh, cool. Like, here's a farmer that did it and did it well. Like, how can I emulate that?
Right.
I do think that has value for sure.
I do. And you know what? This can be applied to journalism outside of just agricultural journalism. I do think feature stories are important because they tend to be kind of the more uplifting portion of the news. And look, like, we all live in this world today, and we know that it can be stressful to open up a newspaper or go onto a news website and read, you know, about some things that are going on. But then to be able to also read a story where this person is making it work for themselves and they've overcome whatever particular challenge popped up in their life or on their farm, that's nice to be able to read that sort of thing. It gives one hope.
Yeah. I do think it goes both ways, but I was a little surprised that, you know, she said basically her story isn't that unique of like coming to the farm at like as a second career choice. And now we have definitely talked to many people who did not start in farming and ended up in farming, but I definitely don't think that is just like, oh, this is how most people do it. Like,
I
don't know.
Agree with that.
I don't know but I think her experience is cool and unique in the fact that she was an ag journalist without a farming background, which is kind of where I am right now. And then to end up actually farming afterwards, like, I do think that's a really cool story for sure. Like,
it is, yeah. And I mean, look, like, she and her husband, like, they made it work. Like, they were presented with something that was definitely a challenge, and they rose to it. So, you know, I respect them for that, for sure.
Yeah.
All right, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you all for listening. If you like this episode, please consider subscribing if you haven't already done so. If you really like this episode, please consider leaving us a review.
If you have any questions or thoughts about the episode, you can email us at farmhouse@lancasterfarming.com.
You can also find us on social media at Lancaster Farming on most platforms.
Thank you again for visiting the farmhouse. I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Candace.
We'll talk to you later.
Bye.
This episode of The Farmhouse is copyright 2026 by Lancaster Farming newspaper, part of the Steinman Communications family.
It was written by Stephanie Spiker and Candace Rosbowski. It was produced by Eric Herlock. It was mixed by Justin Berger. Original music by Eric Herlock.